My name is Saima Akhtar. I'm the Associate Director of the Vagelos Computational Science Center at Barnard College. And the center's main aim is to really lower the barrier of entry into computing for women and non-binary students at Barnard College and beyond, and really bolster and strengthen computational skills and digital literacy across all disciplines. And so related to that, I was lucky to find a partner in Tazeen Khan, who is the founder of Cyber Collective, who I'll introduce in a moment. But together we were just talking about Open Data Week and how useful it is to have public data, especially about New York City. We live here, we interact with the city on a daily basis. It's really important to have that open, accessible data. But we also wanted to talk about some of the unintended consequences that might come up from using open data. And so we're going to be having a part panel discussion today and a part workshop the last 30 minutes. We're really lucky to have two amazing guests with us. And so with that, I'm just going to give a quick introduction and then hand it off to Tazeen. So first we have Idaline Bobet, a Philly native residing in Harlem, New York. She's the founder of techactivist.org and co-founder of techintersections.org, a human rights activist, and is a human rights activist with the Poor People's Campaign. She's also currently head of ops at Maroxa, which is focused on building data infrastructure and supporting the open source data movement. Also, we have Trisha Wong, who is a tech ethnographer obsessed with designing equity into systems. She is part data geek, designer, and community organizer, and her belief is that technology must serve humanity from the public to the private sector. She is co-founder of Sudden Compass, a consulting firm working with Fortune 500 companies and tech startups to generate insights from big data. Most recently, she co-founded Cradle, I hope I'm saying that, CRADL, the Crypto Research and Design Lab based out of the World Economic Forum. And then we have our co-host, Tazeen Khan, who is a cybersecurity specialist of 10 plus years with a focus on program compliance, third-party risk management, and product mapping for Fortune 500 companies. In 2020, after learning that Black Lives Matter protesters were being tracked and targeted on social media, Tazeen mobilized her community and founded Cyber Collective in an effort to increase awareness of the importance of digital protection. Today, Cyber Collective is recognized by Forbes as the, quote, only women of color owned and operated community-centered research organization that focuses on data ethics, privacy, and cybersecurity research. And with that, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. So excited to be here. And the topic of conversation is data and technology. And we all know that technology is a lot more than scrolling through memes and catching a convenient ride on Uber. And don't get us wrong, especially at Cyber Collective, we love a meme. And we're realizing that technology and data specifically is such an extension of who we are and how we show up in the world. I'm assuming that many of us here, especially all of the women that I see at least, have experienced firsthand both the positive and negative effects of technology, ranging from the amazing technologies that we leverage that give us how many steps we've taken throughout the day. That help me at least recognize when I'm going to get my period, which is really helpful for me. And then there's also the negative effects of technology that end up creating a lot of inequities through social media, healthcare, personal finance. Our data gets used, it gets shared and sold, right? Which consequently reinforces societal and economic inequities. And so it's no wonder that self-determination over how our information exists in the world is crucial to making the playing field more equitable. But we can't do this alone. And we can't do it without critical thinking or spaces like today's and what the open data is doing, right? So to build a healthier data ecosystem, we need a movement of people who think critically about their relationship with technology. And the key to building this movement is tapping the power of the people who translate complex information for everyone to understand and for people that are just looking to understand as well. So speaking of translators and speaking of people in the movement, Trisha and Idaline, the first question is, tell us a little bit about who you are and your relationship with data. And I'll look to Idaline and then Trisha, you can follow. Hey everyone, my name is Idaline. I'm from Philly. I would say growing up from North Philly, data and my relationship with data was a very hurtful, like it came from like a hurtful, painful place. Why? Because I went to a school where it was a school to prison pipeline where data was used against young people to tell us what box we can fit in, what limitation, what we are limited to. So I always ask, like, why am I a statistic? Why do I have to be so fearful about being another statistic? And who is collecting all this data and telling me what I can be and who I can become? So I went to school, which that is an entire different podcast. I was arrested 4 times in high school, went through like a whole bunch of stuff. But I went to school and I studied data, applied statistics, and I studied the surveys. And I had this big goal of just really understanding how data was collected and making sure it was used to empower Black and Brown communities, specifically from poor communities, all poor communities across the globe, and not to criminalize communities. And that has basically been my relationship with data. I definitely wear different hats in in my life with data, but I can talk about that more. I just want to pass the mic to Trisha and we'll continue the conversation.
Thanks. So I think my relationship to data, like I didn't really know what data was. Like I don't think like people grew up here like, oh, this is data, at least not when I was growing up. But what I did see as I started to work is I started to realize that all the injustices and the isms that I was seeing, sexism, racism, homophobism, transphobism, all of this stuff, a lot of it came back to what I've now called the quantification bias, where it's the misuse of numbers and using numbers as a way to justify whatever kind of biases you have, and then layering that with quantitative numbers, and then refusing to see anything else that is not represented in the form of numbers. And so a lot of what I saw as somebody who was growing up in the Bay Area was that why were certain populations being treated better? Why was it that, Asian immigrants, the ones I grew up around, why were some Asian immigrants getting loans from the government? And why are people who've been here forever, like Black community, Latino communities, why were they not getting loans? A lot of these things come down to the way numbers are being processed and used to justify fundamental ideas around racism or expectations around people. And a lot of that is hidden around numbers. And so I think what's become my life's work is to figure out how do I fight and how do I enable organizations and individuals like all of us to have the narratives to fight what I call the quantification bias. Because right now, numbers are being weaponized to justify all sorts of things. And what numbers do is they really hide the human story and they hide the human element. So I remember being in arguments. I eventually grew up part of my life in a very highly conservative area. And I would hear arguments like, well, X percentage of people commit crimes and they come from these kind of neighborhoods. And if you actually look into the numbers, you start to think what's behind the numbers. Perhaps there's historical racism that's laced into the data that's been collected. And now you're throwing that into algorithmic decision-making programs. And so you see the ramifications of that. The quantification bias only gets worse the more automated our systems become, because it becomes harder to interrogate the source of the data. And it becomes harder to figure out, saying that, weapons of mass destruction, if that's exactly the point behind that, is that numbers are being used to hurt communities and they hide all of these biases. So that is, I would say, starting point of where I'd say my relationship to data is. So it totally resonates with what you were saying, Italy.
Thanks for that, both of you. So I just wanted to follow up and ask, would you make a distinction between public and private data? And that's to either of you. And if so, what is it?
Trisha, I'll let you go first this time.
I'm not going to say here's like hard definitions, but I think for me, like open data is something that is accessible. And you can download the data set and you can interrogate it and look at it. Whereas private data sets, if there's no download button. So mine's a very practical thing. And like, is there a download button that everyone can download the data set? So someone can say their data set is open, but if there's no way to publicly to make it accessible to me, that goes into private territory for me.
and also who can add to it. If it's only one person or one organization that's contributing and building out that data versus if we all here are adding to that data set and maybe we see something wrong, but since we're here as a collective, we can say, oh, all of the data is not being collected. And we can just add to this to really make it wholesome and really be used for empowerment. I'm not too sure if you all would like us to step back and answer the different relationships we have with data, because I know I wanted to be short and talk on my original relationship with data, but like many people, we have so many layers. So definitely that's my upbringing with data, which really, Trisha, brought me on my activist path on what, when, why, and just seeing how data was just used to harm people. So the activist in me, I love to educate people. So I'm an educator, and that's my relationship also with data, with educating people on how data is being collected, how companies are using data, learning about their privacy rights. A lot of people don't know their own rights, the amendments, what we have, regardless if you're a citizen or not, how data can be used against them and how to truly advocate for themselves. And I'm also a tech worker. So I feel then it makes it complex because I'm like part of the big bad wolf as well. When I've been on the tech side on and off for like 10 years. And I'll give you like an example of how this all can be layered in. I remember a friend working on a project that she wasn't supposed to tell me about, was just like, oh, really excited about this project that's coming out. When people come into the stores, we're using facial recognition to pull up their credit scores so that people know, like the sales folks can know what to pitch to them. And it's going to make everything just easy. And you know exactly, it's going to empower the sales folks. And I was like, oh my gosh, who's on this team? This is just ridiculous. We need an ethical lens in this. This can completely isolate people. It's a disaster. And this was a Black woman. And she just, wait, what? I didn't think of it from that lens. And so I don't think it's always intentional. I think people are always excited about the tech that they're creating, especially when you're working for a tech company. That's where your money's coming from. And you want to empower the business to client, but you do need an ethical person there to say, okay, wait, how can this harm people? How can this harm different communities? Is this the right thing to do? I also work, Trisha, as a consultant to many nonprofits, where I also have them question a lot of nonprofits to even get money. They're collecting data. And it's just, do you need that data? Do you need all those details just to give funding or just to help someone or to have someone attend this event? Do you need that data? If that data set was, if someone had this information and you're working with a marginalized community, how would that data hurt someone? So how can you use data enough, sadly, to get funds and funding from foundations, but not to hurt the communities that you're working with? So it's always like we're having so many different hats, where as a tech worker, I'm learning about the many ways products are being used and being empowered by data and data driven. And then as an activist, I'm like, hey, community, this is what's happening. We need to protect ourselves. And as a nonprofit consultant, I'm like, okay, can we do better? Can we not be like a for-profit data driven company?
Yeah, I think that distinction is really important to make. Trisha, do you want to say something about how your relationship to data changes depending on what hat you're wearing?
Yeah, so I think like Adeline, I'm in multiple communities, and I think this is actually really important to my work, because I don't say like I'm some kind of open data advocate, because I think there's a lot of binary thinking in the data world. In particular with open data, you have people who think automatically just because you build civic technologies or open data that you're doing good, like as if that's tech for good or ICT for development or like pro-social technology. I'm like, no, screw you. If you work in open data, you can be just as harmful about data with your data as someone who's working in the private sector under commercial conditions. If anything, I see even more harmful practices, because one, in open data organizations, they don't get the funding. This is a problem with funders, that funders and the people managing it don't think about actually what it takes to maintain an infrastructure of open data. And it's exactly what you were talking about. And funders perpetuate this issue because they're willing to give money because they want to say, oh, we funded this sexy program around data, but they're not thinking about what it takes to maintain that data set. And they're not doing the follow-up to be like, what do you actually do? Where is it actually sitting? Once the program closes down, what are you doing with that kind of knowledge isn't happening. So I find that oftentimes I see more harms in the open data space. And because re-identification is possible, and increasingly the skills sets are getting even better, the algorithms and the computational programs of re-identification. I remember there was like some kind of Netflix study where it's called the Netflix Prize, where they gave out this random data set that was harmless about what movies or people were watching, totally anonymized, and people were able to re-anonymize it. They were able to identify and reattach it legitimately to names. So I have a very critical take on open data. I don't say I'm like some kind of open data proponent. I say I am a proponent for people and safe harm reduction into the data. I'm a proponent for people to have control of their data. And that is where I stand, because I think that open data becomes this like tool. You're better in this space if you're working in the nonprofit civic tech space. And there's a lot of people like who judge you because you're working with corporations too. And I'm like, no, corporations have power. And if I can like Elaine, be inside helping corporations think through their corporate practices as it relates to data, that's incredibly important. And oftentimes they have more resources to keep people's data safe. And so I think it's really important that we get rid of binary thinking and have any kind of assumption that just because open data is something that's positive or pro-social or good, which is why we're here. Which is why at first I was like, I am not speaking at an Open Data Week thing. And then, no, we're here to be critical of it. And I was like, oh, I'm willing to speak then. Because I support anything the chat does, but like, still, I was just like, I don't open data.
And I'm so happy that we're getting deep and we're getting real. And anybody here from CSC Open Data, don't be fearful. This is the positive part. We got to get uncomfortable sometimes to allow for the positive movement and make sure that we're implementing a lot of these like ethical questions that we're thinking about. And I think, Idaline, both you and Trisha touched upon, I think the way that we look at data, like you said, Trisha, can be looked at very binary. And because it has to do when it's attached to humans, and so much to do with our identities, it's deeply layered. And when we think about data, it's a part, someone said this at MozFest earlier this week during our session. She mentioned data is a part of an economy. And the way that I like to explain it as well is it's a galaxy. When you think about these, trying to conceptualize the different nuances and aspects, somebody from one perspective, Idaline, like you shared, the woman at that store thought that taking somebody's information and credit score would be positive. And we all think to the limit of our lived experience. And we all think to the limit of whatever circumstances we're in. And that's how I think sometimes data is leveraged. And a critical part of this dialogue that we're having is for us to think about what type of ethical questions can we consider while we go to use any type of data, and can there be consensus? But as far as consensus, a question that I'm so curious to hear perspective on is, do you think that there is a standard way for data to be categorized by large industries like tech or healthcare? We know that there is standardization that exists, but it's not something that's applicable across all industries. Do you think there should be standardization? And if there was, what would be the drawbacks and the benefits? Or is there not enough standardization? And I don't know enough myself to really know. So I would ask the both of you experts to share.
So I can start that and hopefully pass the baton to Trisha. So is there a standard on how data is collected? And I would say there's not. Right now, it's like a grab all. As much information as you can grab data in a structured way where you can then use it for Netflix if I want to look at Black films or horror films or rom-coms, and everything's structured. And it's a very table, columns and rows, and it looks very pretty and it's relational. You understand what you're looking at, the who, what, when, why this was collected. And then you have a structured data where it's nothing, maybe your news articles, that they're listed with tags and metadata that's collected like from your phones. And then you have tons of unstructured data where
people don't, it could be pictures and movies. It doesn't even have to be like a number. It could be a mix of anything that you can basically create meaning, and there's no real standard way. So typically you have structured and again, unstructured data and a multitude of data sources where people have like data lakes and data warehouses. And there are so many sources of data because right now the world is full of data with the Internet of Things. Data is the new oil. Data, it's part of the economy. It's part of the way of life now. And I can't say there are ways companies are trying to be compliant with HIPAA if it's a healthcare information, like what data you can have there. There are different compliances called SOC 2 Type 1, SOC 2 Type 2. There are so many acronyms on how long you can hold on to data. But really, even if I was an organization, I don't have to necessarily be compliant to still do work and put stuff out there and content out there. And I do think because there are so many organizations and right now, a lot of people who are creating policies, they don't know enough about data because a government paycheck versus a tech paycheck, two different things. I worked for nonprofits and grassroots organizations for 10 years, making less than $65,000. And when the pandemic came and those foundations and money got stopped, and I was like, oh, I'm about to be homeless. I know I have skill sets that are very marketable. And I went over to a tech company who can pay me money that other organizations can't. And that's the dilemma that you have where the people who are supposed to do the compliance and keep order, we don't have enough of those people. And Trisha, I don't know if you can talk more on that, but I'm
definitely not an expert on standardization of data. So but I will say it's what I wish is, because you definitely know more about this than me, but what I do try and advocate for is a standardization of the way we even think about data, the way we even approach data collection. Because I actually am a bit jaded. I don't think it's possible to standardize data collection because I think there's just different types of data sets have different types of data norms. And I think industries have to figure that out. I think that's just a reality. I don't understand when we have to standardize data collection. It's what Idalene was saying, the healthcare industry. And it gets down to if you're collecting genetic data versus different kinds of data about like where you lived or your credit scoring, that is going to be used in different ways. So there's different duties of care that are required for each type of data set. And there's different norms around shareability. And there's different norms around culture and around regions around data. A lot of the work that I did in China to look at, is anonymity possible in a country where there's an authoritarian regime, and there's no expectation on privacy. Privacy is so loaded of a word. And I think that a lot of standardization of data collection, what you're doing is you're actually enforcing the hegemony of whatever your point of view is. And in particular, it's often a Western point of view. But the reality is there's different perspectives on data. How someone feels about health data in one country or one region is very different. So I think it's a pointless process to go down to the metadata level of standardization. But here are a few things where I would like to have standardized is I think it's important to standardize that before you build out or as you're building out a universal data model, which every program has it. If you're doing anything with data, you're building out a universal data model set. So before you build out your universal data model, which is your big data, right? You're saying these are the variables we're going to work with or to collect or whatever. That's when the universal data model gets built. It's literally, it sounds like crazy universal data model, but it's literally just like a bunch of people being like, I want this variable on A. Do we collect timestamp on timestamp? And do we get geolocation data? Yes or no? What I wish would happen is to say, as we do that, we should be building it on top of a human model first and foremost, because that's going to help you figure out what kind of big data models you need to collect, is you need to understand the thick data, which is a qualitative data that happens at the human layer. And what I find, what happens oftentimes in open data conversations and why I tend to be allergic to them is oftentimes people think the data set was open, which it always means quantitative. We're never talking about qualitative, which I get, that is what open data is, but it's oftentimes a shortcut. People think it's a shortcut to understanding human models or to understanding humans. And I'm like, that data could only tell you what was happening at that one point in time or the last time there was that snapshot of the data. But it doesn't tell you why something is happening. If you want to look at 311 data in New York City, it's like if you want to know why something happened, you have to actually start to ask people and talk to people. But oftentimes what I see happening in civic tech or other places that tend to use open data, they think it's a shortcut where you don't have to understand the human model layer. So oftentimes what I see in humanitarian work is organizations will descend down upon a place and be like, oh, we have open data on this area. They're not actually talking to people to understand, well, does our universal data model make sense for the variables we're collecting? Do the assumptions make sense? And here's one example is that for a client that is a large music streaming business, that we all may just have used, is that there is an assumption that was baked in because stories affect data models, right? Like the way we use big data, we think it's all just numbers. It's actually an aggregation. There's stories behind it. So for example, like if you have an algorithm and let's say this company assumes that people have very static genres of listening to music. Well, in their universal data model, they're going to collect the variable of what genre of music you're listening to. But what they were not collecting was understanding how people were listening to music over time and how that changed across age groups. They weren't doing that analysis. And so one of the insights we gave them in our qualitative big data work was that actually there's no such thing as only a genre listener. That's actually that issue you have when you originally started your company. But actually people's music tastes vary across. And there's no assumption. And we actually helped them change their universal data model as a result. And we changed the way their team would use learning algorithms. So it's an example of how the qualitative insight, we had to go talk to people, find the stories. We only talked to 12 people, but that was like enough to give us insight to change the quantitative data model. And the second thing I just wish was standardized for how data was collected. I just wish there was threat modeling always being done on everything inside corporations and the nonprofits. I see Taz being like, yes, and I see yes. And this is something that Daniel Raymond, who is a war crimes investigator and genocide investigator, talks a lot about that in the humanitarian space. But I think it should be done across the board. Even in your example, is I wish that person who you're speaking to, and I'm so glad they spoke to you. And I wish that they knew to do some threat modeling ahead of time because they would have quickly figured out that there's a reason why a humongous part of the population doesn't have high credit scores. And it's not because they don't know how to save money or use money. It has nothing to do with that. And it's because there's some systematic racism embedded into our financial systems. And I can only imagine. So I'm so glad you were there to intervene. So I'm glad you did the threat modeling for her. That's like on the spot.
Trisha, can you expand on what you mean by threat modeling?
I think threat modeling means there's different ways we do threat modeling, but it's literally just looking at all the different scenarios that could happen. And there are entire workshops and experts who do this, but it's really making sure that we spend time before as we're building out. And threat modeling is not just a one-time thing. It's like something that you do that's ongoing because the threat changes as the context changes. So for example, Red Cross's entire database, 500,000 individuals, refugees, and people who were fleeing, was hacked. And Daniel Raymond was warning them about this for years, has been warning the humanitarian base, saying the threat modeling is that our systems are not safe. These kind of NGOs are not set up to secure their own data. So it's anticipating who are the actors that would want this data and what would they do with it. And the humanitarian space is one of the most sensitive data spaces. That's like almost obvious as a word. So you have people want to kidnap, or you have dictators who are going to be searching for where these people are or who are under witness protection. I think threat modeling should be done in a corporation to be like, hey, if we're collecting data about like women's periods or my iPhone, and like Apple does a lot of good threat modeling. I'm not against this whole like, oh, companies and corporations are automatically bad because we have private data and we make money. It depends on your intent and it depends on the values of the shareholders and the stakeholders. And for Apple, I think they've done a really good job on threat modeling, and they put a stake out there to say we believe in protecting people's data. So I hope that gives a summary. If anyone else has anything to say about threat modeling, please jump in.
Yeah, no, I think people in the chat were wondering what you meant by that. And I think that was really good explanation. So before, Adeline, if you wanted to say something, I just also wanted to say you're getting towards this next question that we wanted to ask, which was, is there an ethical way to collect data? And what I'm hearing from Trisha, at least, is that this phrase duty of care is really sticking out to me. And it's not just about collecting numbers and numbers and numbers and letting the numbers speak for themselves. It's a lot more than that. And the duty of care, from what I'm hearing you say, is actually a very multidisciplinary endeavor. And I wonder if you can say a little more about that. And Adeline, of course, jump in.
And do your teams have the diversity of people from disciplines and backgrounds, as you say, to reflect that duty of care? And I think if we understood duty of care as we're not protecting people's privacy, but we're protecting people's personhood, everything changes. So this is why I don't say I'm a privacy advocate, and I really try and help people in the data space to see that actually what we're all fighting for is not privacy. Because privacy is about like my data, and privacy is now being weaponized. You see all these governments all around the country, in the world, and states passing laws to protect consumer and citizen privacy. But what they're really introducing is laws that actually thwart privacy and they're trying to end things like end-to-end encryption that actually protect people. And what we're really fighting for, privacy made sense in a world where we were collecting people's data and like data was out there and I'm here. That framework so I'm not saying that like it's a bad thing to do, but what I'm saying is we have completely transitioned to a different world where we are the data. It's not that I have given my data, I've uploaded and it's sitting here in the cloud and here I am doing and living my own life. It's that we have given our data, we have been abstracted out so much into digital bits and we live in millions of instantiations out there in digital space. That is us. So that is me. So if you have my data, you actually have me as if you had a piece of my arm. And it only becomes obvious when you look at how data is treated for the most marginalized community, because that's where you see it the most. We see this the most when it comes to people with darker skin, which tends to be Black and Afro-Latino communities, of the way facial recognition is done, where they're just walking around the city and then their face gets captured. And then all of a sudden they get identified, especially males, identified as someone who was committing crime. And their whole life stops because then they have to, and that's an example where your personhood is at risk. So I think the duty of care would shift if we actually thought about we're not protecting people's data and their privacy, is we're protecting people, because this is our new life. We are now so digital that the value of our digital data is more valuable than our actual physical bodies. And that data is me. It's not an instantiation. It is me. And what we need to fight for control for is not our privacy, is we need to have control of representation. That is what happens in the world of personhood when that data is us. We have to have policies reflect how can we better understand representation. Because before in the Renaissance, you would have a painting of yourself. That was a painting, but if you destroyed the painting, you wouldn't destroy the person. Similar in the early 90s or the early 2000s, or even 10 years ago, if you looked at my data on my website went down, it wasn't like I was destroyed. But now you can actually control someone's data and their life would be destroyed if you took away their Facebook, their WhatsApp. I think it's all, I want to hear more about you doing all the work you're doing I think your stories likely speak to this, where you're seeing instances where if someone fucks with your data, your life is over, because that is you.
When it comes to the ethical question, and I agree with you, Trisha, we are our data, and there are so many data points on us that it's really hard to take us out. And when you're thinking about data and democracy, demo of the people, that's what democracy is, the people govern. We can't, are we living in a society where there's a true democracy, because the people don't even know enough about data to vote on a policy, to create language for a policy to protect us. When you're thinking about the ethical question about data, I think the big thing is for us to ask, in order for it to be ethical, can I opt out? Can I opt out? And right now I cannot opt out. So long as I have my phone, even if I don't have Facebook, you have shadow profiles, because people are collecting numbers and Facebook will have my information even without me being on their platform. I cannot opt out. So I think when we're thinking about even collecting data, can I opt out, especially if there's a power dynamic? Clearly, if we are trying to pull information on the 1% and we're trying to pull information because we want more transparency on whatever we wanted to answer, more than likely, they will never allow for that to happen because they have the power. So when we're thinking about what data is being collected, it's normally people who don't have power, who can't opt out, who, even if your job is collecting it, you don't want to rock the boat because you need that paycheck. You don't want to rock the boat, even if you're unemployed, but you need resources. And right now, the government, we're so tied to government and data because we're supposedly living in a democracy where the government's going to help us. Even in today's world, who got vaccine, who got paychecks, like the stimulus packages, like all of this is based on data. And yeah, I think we're definitely in interesting times. But when I think of as an individual person collecting data on people, do I give them the option to opt out? And that's a really important start. Wow. Woo! Woo! The fire in this room is so good right now. And and something that I want to share too, especially for the folks that are in here, because we're talking about duty of care and we're talking a lot about other organizations and entities that have the power, and there could be a sentiment of leaving us powerless. And I want to just remind everyone in this room that you are not powerless, and that there are ways for you to be able to understand these concepts and build your own sense of duty of care. And that's essentially why Cyber Collective exists and why we wanted to participate in this dialogue, because something I think about is whose responsibility is it? Is it my responsibility to advocate for myself and my data? Or is it my responsibility to ask tech companies or the government to advocate on my behalf? And there's a weight that bears often on the people that are being harmed to have to advocate for themselves. You're harming me, and then now I gotta start a revolution. Now I have to start a nonprofit to try to combat the harm that's happening. And so I think everything that you all shared is so beautiful and so impactful and powerful, especially as it relates to activists and nonprofits and the need to collect data. And I want to remind everybody in the room too that collection of data isn't always negative, but there are a lot of narratives that exist in the public that are taking up space. And that space is a lot of the digital media systems and the way that they're collecting data. But there are some incredible things that have happened with data collection through biometric data collection, health information. But again, as both Trisha and Idalyn said, like the lack of threat modeling or the lack of representation in the rooms, we're not thinking through the unintended consequential harms that come from, like we just mentioned, not having all of the pieces that we need to connect. And I'm not sure that we will find that answer, but at least everyone is thinking about it. And that goes to my next question. As far as communities that potentially might be able to use open data for activism, what recommendations might you have for them to be able to use like data as a resource? How can we leverage what exists in society to benefit the movements that are starting up essentially? So I definitely just want to start the conversation again and let it flow where it goes. I do think it's really important to lift up my mentor. I have a mentor, Sister Elaine Brown, former chairperson of the Black Panther Party. And I know a lot of people don't know that we are in Women's History Month. So let's shout them out when she's the only woman chairperson of the Black Panther Party in any organization in that like huge capacity. The Black Panther Party in 1972 talked about community control of modern technology. Again, 1972, the same conversation we're having in 2022, the Black Panther Party had this, it was part of their 10-point platform, community control of modern technology, where they asked the technology question of what would happen to society if only private companies basically had access to data and could communicate and target populations, versus what would happen if the people had data and could communicate to others to empower one another. And a lot of the Black Panther Party, it brought a conversation, it educated people, and it really is going for like policy changes. But again, if you don't know about data, how can you even start shifting the policy? So you have that. I do think as we think of like activist communities, I worked with an organization, very old school. And why I do think I'm just going to like put some love on New York City open data. So pour some little love on it. So New York City open data law passed in 2012. It was signed in effect by Mayor Bloomberg, which is a very problematic person. So you could just think who, what, when, why was this created? Why did he have this interest? Obviously, tech has a lot of money, so follow the money. We bring this. But what beautiful output came of this is before this tool, people basically had to know about the Freedom of Information Act and law to request and pull certain data from police agencies or from government agencies and grab this data that is rightfully owed to the public so that we can do research. And we no longer, with the open data, New York open data, we no longer, for lots of data sets, they have about like 1,600 data sets. We don't have to do that for that. We still have to pull information, but it does allow us to have some information at our disposal that's disposed to us. I used to volunteer at this organization called Lucy Parsons Lab. This lab is located and founded in Chicago. And basically, they would have the Freedom of Information law, work with police officers and police departments to get information on all the complaints made on police officers. And then volunteers like myself would manually create a database and enter all this information. Thankfully, with a tool like New York Open Data, you don't have to do that because all the information is there. You can do charts. Again, maybe not for all the information, but just sharing that this is a good tool where it takes a lot of labor off of us. And I would say there are good stories. And maybe if we don't find all the information that we want in a public data, it doesn't mean a story is not there. It doesn't mean it's not important. And what I mean by that, if you look at the unemployment rate, supposedly you could go online, it's all on Google, it's all on the government's information. Before the pandemic, it was a very low. It's what Trump used to always say, it's like the lowest. Black people had the lowest unemployment rate in ever of all history under Trump. Did it feel that way? I'm Black, Puerto Rican, Cuban. Did it feel that way in my neighborhood? When I look at people in Chicago, did it feel that way in that neighborhood? In New York, in Philly, in Detroit? It did not feel that way. So just because something is out there, it could also not be the truth of what we are facing. So just as an activist who's pulling information, sometimes you have to demystify information and pull stories, our stories, and say, though this is public data, this information is on our government, it's not what's happening. It's not our reality. So I would say keep digging. But go ahead. I didn't hear what you said.
No, I was saying that's a great example of the quantification bias. You're asking people to look beyond what the number is saying and actually listen and feel the community experience and talking to people like you.
Yes.
I'm going to just jump in the last 2 minutes. So we have 2 minutes left for the discussion part at least. And then we have to let one of our fantastic panelists go. But I'm just curious from both of you after this really short discussion, what you hope people will leave with.
I hope people leave with understanding that open data doesn't mean automatically good and that it's positive and that you have to treat it with just as much duty of care and that we don't abuse it just because it's open. I totally agree that it's incredible we have all these data sets now. But I also see just as it's not a solution in that if you have open data and problems are solved, it's that it's a means to an end. And I see oftentimes that people are running hackathons and oftentimes it's civic tech and they're still not doing what Evelyn is saying, which is that they're looking at the data, but they're not actually talking to community. They don't have anyone from this community on their teams, making a lot of assumptions about solutions or creating prototypes and just not actually thinking through what the impact is on the community. So I hope people walk away with understanding that it's very complex and it's not just automatic or binary. And that second, and that it's not that what we're fighting for here, everyone, is it's not privacy. We're fighting for the future of our personhood, of our digital humanity. We are now more digital than we are physical. We live very bifurcated lives. You're either hyper local now or we're hyper virtual, where this is my community online and you all. And we spend more time in that kind of space. So we have a digital humanity and we have so much stuff to figure out. So I think it's not just specific actions, but it's like specific ways of thinking we have to shift to make sure that we're fighting for the right thing, which is our own survival as a species, as people in a digital space. And I want us to have a language for that, which is it's not about privacy, it's about personhood.
Yes, I love all of that. Unfortunately, we're already living in the metaverse. All my friends are in the metaverse, one online. I'm really sad about that. That's not how I thought I would see my adult life at all. I do think, as Trisha was saying, the word is like human-centered design. That's like the practice, where if you collect information or you're building something out, you do want to bring the people. You want human-centered design. If you're thinking about in the tech space, a lot of people create MVPs, a small form of their product that they can put out in the public and build upon it. When you're dealing with open source or you're dealing with nonprofits, you don't have that funding or bandwidth. So you just put it out before you test to see if it works, before you test to see how it may harm communities, before you can see if this doesn't work. Do we roll it out or do we take it back and keep testing it and make sure we're doing something? So I would say if you're creating something, make sure it's doing what it was supposed to, and like the intention. If it was intended to do this, make sure it's doing that. Some questions when you're thinking about data is like, why was this data collected? As you're looking through data sets, like, why was this data collected? Who collected the data? Just think as when we were kids and we were reading a book, the teacher would say, who, what, when, why? It's like there's so much information that's shared by asking that. When was this data collected? What was the goal of why this data had to be collected? What questions did they use, or what framework did they use, and how long would this data be kept? So I would say those are some questions when you're looking at the data. Just as important as the data is like who, why, what, when, how was the data collected? All those are really important questions. Yeah. Go ahead, Tizzy, anything. I was just going to say, what a super fruitful conversation. Seriously, my mind is just continuing because there's so much dialogue to be had, to continue to have. And my personal takeaway from all of this is a couple of things. Duty of care. The other would be understanding the stories behind the data and how it impacts marginalized groups, potentially, which I really hate that word, to be honest, marginalized, right? But how the global majority, let's say that instead. And the other, all of the different kind of threat modeling questions that you just went through at the end, Idaline, to make sure that we are considering all aspects and what we're doing with data. And that's a large part of all of the folks in the security industry and the personhood industry, privacy, personhood. That's another huge takeaway of using that word and somebody being in this industry. I'm definitely going to say personhood over privacy moving forward. So I just want to say personally, thank you for being a part of this dialogue, for Barnard inviting Cyber Collective to be a part of this dialogue, and for New York Open Data Week for having us, and for our experts, Trisha and Idaline, sharing your raw thoughts and being authentic in spaces where sometimes it's hard to show up entirely as yourself. And we appreciate you for coming in all of the colors and forms that you are as a human.
I'm going to second all of that. It was just said really eloquently, so I'm just going to second it and thank our panelists again and Trisha. So we're not going to sign off right away, and we're going to transition into a workshop that actually built off of some of the questions I was starting to speak about. And Trisha, feel free to drop off whenever, but I did want to make space for the people watching, joining us. If anyone wants to unmute and speak or just say something, because I know that sometimes it can feel like we're speaking at you. And I just want to make sure that we're creating an environment where we can have dialogue.
Hi, my name is Selena. I appreciate everything that was said today. And I really appreciate all of the speakers and your perspective on just reminding yourself of humanity and just the fact that even behind technology and data, there's human beings that are being affected by this. And so I really appreciate you all just being in this field all together, because just when we think about that example that Idaline, you talked about someone creating this application or program where they could detect someone's credit score, you can, that in itself, that example just showed me those people who are in that design process of developing something like that, they have an intention of creating a marketable product, something that will result in companies being able to make more money. And I think that goes back to the point that Trisha had reiterated about thinking about people's intentions and values. And if we continue to move forward with thinking about how can we maintain the well-being of the human beings that are this data, then yeah, I'd be interested to see like how the tech field in itself can transform to where data could eventually be all like constantly always be used for good. At least that's what I'd hope we'd be able to get towards.
Thank you for sharing. And speaking of and being here, it's awesome. And we're going to have a chance for everybody to participate if you want to in our own threat modeling as we look through some of the data sets from New York City's open data. And thank you again, Trisha. I think she just dropped. So I am going to share my screen and we can jump right in unless if there was anything else that you wanted to touch on.
Nope, go ahead.
So the goal of this, and we are modeling some of the work that we do at Cyber Collective, which I didn't share much about who we are, but as Saima had mentioned, we're a research organization. Well, we're a nonprofit, education and awareness really, and we do research through grounded theory method. And it's really about narrative sharing and understanding people's sentiment toward technology and our relationship with technology. So part of this and the goal of what we're trying to do is come up with a couple of questions, the threat modeling and ethical questions that we might be able to ask ourselves before using a set of open data. And we're hopeful to be able to co-create 2 or 3 questions that we can then pass to the folks over at New York City Open Data, and they might be able to share that with their community as well. Like, yo, before you use this, slow down a second and think about maybe these 3 things. And it came out of our Open Data Week conference, and it's for the community, by the community. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And we have had some interesting findings. I'll say that. For this portion, I would absolutely love for everyone to speak up and talk, be involved. The first thing that I would ask, and if Kaylee or Sarma, if you can drop this link, take a second to open up the link for the New York City's Open Data website. And before I move to the next screen, I would just love to know 2 to 3 things that pop out at you the most as soon as you go on the site. Like, what are the 2 or 3 things that you see or notice immediately when you're on the website? And I'd love to chat about that a little bit, and then we can move into the slam dunk I'm about to make in the next slide.
I don't know if this is like along the lines of what you're thinking, Taz, but it's like all blue. And I feel like that was a choice. And so I'm interested. I don't know if that's along the lines, but
yeah, I love that. That's exactly what we want. This is a part of the sentiment analysis and understanding, because there's definitely psychology behind why we do everything that we do. I think it's called industrial organizational psychology, and it studies human behavior and how it applies to marketing and why we appeal to things. Okay, so things are blue. Anything else we're noticing on the website? I would say, so I see pictures of people, but I don't see the word people. I see the word buildings. I see the word trees. It doesn't say that you can search for things like people and information about people. Okay. Love that. So blue and the pre-populated search terms that you're saying essentially. And there isn't really mention of people, but there are photos of people. Okay. Anything else from anybody? If I can add a second, I'll say I do love that we see how you can get involved right there, right at the top of the page. So I think that's in the spirit of openness, that data is being provided and people can contribute or get involved in some way. Yeah, totally. I love that. Ditto. Those were actually some of the first things that we noticed too when we were ideating on the panel, just essentially the information that's provided and the access points. But what really stuck out to me personally was the pre-populated search terms. This is a very interesting finding. Last night, while I was working on this presentation, because procrastination sometimes wins, and as I was looking through, when we first got together about a month ago, Saima, essentially, the number one thing that I noticed was the pre-populated search terms. The words were 311 things and crime. And the fact that crime was the search term that was pre-populated, I found it to be really interesting, because in my work at Cyber Collective, we talk about bias a lot and how bias is inherent in a lot of the technology that we have. And unfortunately, a lot of the majority bias in the States is not the bias that ends up helping the global majority. And last night, when I went to go search, I saw that the pre-populated search term is no longer crime, but they switched it to trees. I texted Simon, I was like, hey, this kind of ends up impacting the workshop, because the word crimes is gone, and that was going to be the root of a lot of what I talk about. And then thank God for the website called Wayback Archives, I think it's called. Is that word?
Back Machine.
Wayback Machine. And so I was speaking to a former volunteer at Cyber Collective, Farah Islam, who's like very oriented around all things data. And she said, use this site. And I was able to find it. And I saw that Open Data built their website in April of 2017. And the pre-populated search terms were 311, noise, and crime. This stayed the same. And every single day, there was a screenshot taken at multiple hours of the day. And it stayed 311, noise, and crime through April 2018, through 2019, through 2020, through 2021. And it wasn't until yesterday, after 4:35 p.m., that the pre-populated search term was changed from crime to trees, which we don't know why that happened, but we do know that it's manually done. It's not something that is done through a machine. It's something that somebody had to update in their systems. So I love that it changed to trees, but the topic of dialogue that we were going to have is, how do you think pre-populated search terms can impact your own approach or your own approach / perspective when using open data? And that's something that immediately came to mind on my end, especially given some of the most popular data sets and that show up or that people are using when using the website itself. But I wanted to pause there before we move on and do all of the threat modeling and whatnot. But is there any feedback, or does this also catch anybody else's eye, or is it just me sitting on a hill by myself? But I found it fascinating. And if there isn't anybody in this room from NYC Open Data, would love any feedback that you have around the change and why the change was made yesterday. I would love to think it was the influence of the session, but very curious.
Hey, it's Kate. I'm from BetaNYC, I don't work for government. And though we work with formerly known as MODA, the Open Data Team, Open Data Week, Open Data Team, not Open Data Week, so too many terms. But I'm trying to get an answer now to find out. I do not know the answer to that, but I'm texting people to find out.
Yeah.
Because I'm curious too. There is a hypothesis that like Open Data Week has pushed people to talk about trees and like the tree census, but honestly, I don't know. I do know that community boards are big users of open data, and they love to talk about 311 data, noise complaint, and then crime. And also NYPD has their data, and they have the crime like website that everyone talks about that Mayor Adams helped build, CompStat. Yeah, I'll find out and update you if I find out.
Yeah, thank you. And it's just so interesting, and it really is interesting. And even when you think of different community boards and as we dig deeper to try to demystify and think through some questions, it's like, what demographic of people are leveraging community boards, and how is it impacting potentially the global majority or other groups? And so it's all fascinating stuff. So as we move forward, here is a list, and I can't see the top, but here are just some random screenshots. They're not in any order, but the goal is to share with you all the most recent data sets and the most popular data sets. I believe these are the most popular ones. And then the next slide is most recent. And afterwards, it would be to do some threat modeling and answer some questions that I have on the screen. But essentially, take a second to look at these. And then obviously, if you're on the website, take a look through and you can dig down and see what the most popular data sets are. Thank you for linking that, Simon. And here on the next page, like it's just really interesting, like the DOB job application filings, building footprints, New York City NYPD arrest data, motor vehicle collision.
Wow.
Hi.
I think that was a mistake.
Okay, cool. The leading causes of death, which I find so interesting. And I'm wondering, like, are there some like law firms that are digging through these data sets and trying to find potential clients with the leading causes of deaths? And I always think of all of these different types of scenarios, but wondering really, what is this data being used for? And then the next slide, if you see, is the most recent data that's populated, which is a lot around student COVID vaccinations. It had a lot to do with students, school, elementary data. I saw something about the annual sustainability project grants. If there's anything else that pops out to anyone, please add it in the chat. I didn't grab every screenshot, but there are like tons of pages of different data sets that do exist. Let me see if there's anything else. No, they're not in hierarchy or in relation to one or the other. So I believe that it's all different.
The most recent ones or the most popular ones?
The most popular ones. The most recent ones.
So those are the most accessed, right?
The most popular ones are the most accessed, yes. And then the most recent ones, I believe it's just the most recent that has been updated to date.
Yeah.
And these are in that order, aside from the ones on the right side, which I screenshot after scrolling through a little bit more because it was a lot of the student COVID vaccination data that was on there. Okay, so we saw the most popular, we see the most recent. And now the next part is just the discussion. This isn't necessarily a workshop. It's more so thinking about how this data potentially is being used and thinking through the different ways that people might, both the positive and the negative ways. What are the potential use cases of these data sets? How can they be leveraged? An example, right? Like how would eviction data be used by developers or Zillow or other real estate tech companies for marketing or just simple outreach, or the building footprints? As soon as I saw the building footprints, for some reason, immediately, I don't know why my mind went so dark, but I just thought, oh my gosh, is this the way serial killers are looking at different buildings to try to find people? I don't know why. I watch a lot of Law and Order SVU, so that's probably where my brain is at, but do not go into the dark trenches of my brain. Relatable, but if you all are open to it, I'd love to think through at least like, how would you consider the potential use cases, especially going back to some of the most popular data sets here. What do you think the use case for the leading causes of death are, and what people might be using that data for?